There are night calls you put in the log, check the boxes on the report, and forget about by morning. And then there are the ones that follow you home, that sit in the back of your head when you turn out the light and make every shadow in the house feel like a closed fist. These are 3 of those calls, true from officers who were there. The first is about a dog who refused to go into a room. The second is about a voice on a 911 line that sounded like a child, and what we found when we answered it. The third is about a midnight hang-up that led to a basement nobody wanted to open. Every one of them happened on streets that looked ordinary in daylight. Listen close, this is what the night hides. I handled wrecks. People ask me about K9s like they're tools, like you can plug them in and expect them to work the same every shift. Rex was not a tool. He was a partner. He'd been with me longer than half the guys on the squad had been on the force. German shepherd, steady head, never the first to spike on adrenaline. He'd walked into burning houses. He'd gone through metal detectors and been smacked with elbows and barking crowds, and he'd just keep working. He had one flaw. He trusted me, which made what happened that night worse because I trusted him too. The call came after a foot pursuit that went cold. We had a description. Male, medium build, hoodie, ran east from the park. But the suspect slipped away in a quiet subdivision where every lawn had a sprinkler system and the streetlights were the type that dim after midnight. The homeowners in that particular block were out of town. The neighbor had been the one to call us when he heard someone pounding around on a back porch. Access from the alley was clear. It was the kind of call that smells routine. Search, clear, get out. What you learn quick in night patrol is that ordinary things are the ones that will surprise you. We cleared the back door, me with a light, Rex on a long line. The back of the house was ordinary. Patio chairs stacked, a grill with a tarp, a sliding door slightly ajar. Inside, the living room smelled like stale air and someone's left coffee. We moved methodically, sweeping rooms the way we were trained to, lights low, voices low. The radio kept the beat, a dispatcher confirming one unit on scene, another creeping up the street. Procedure. It's supposed to give you comfort. It mostly just keeps you honest. Upstairs was the odd part. There's a difference between a hallway that's been left closed for a while and one that seems sealed against the world. The upstairs felt shut down, the air thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. I pushed the bedroom door open with my shoulder, the flashlight catching dust motes. Rex at my side, ears forward, tail relaxed but not wagging. We swept the bedroom quickly. Bed made, nothing out of place, drawers shut, closet doors closed but not jammed. Bathroom checked, sink dry, mirror fog free. Routine. We started to cross the hallway when Rex stopped. Not a slow hesitation. He froze, as if clipped at the neck. His hackles rose. He let out a low growl under his breath, the kind that vibrates in your chest. I remember thinking at first that he had picked up a scent, that maybe a neighbor's cat had wandered in. I called out the way you do when you want to put a little light on a tense moment. "Police, come out, we're clearing the house," to let anyone inside know we were there. No answer. The hallway at the end, where the light tapered off, held a shape. It was a figure standing at the far end, just inside a doorway, not moving, not looking at me. From 20 feet away, it could have been a coat rack, a mannequin, any inanimate thing placed in a doorway. The light cut between us in a hard line. Rex barked once, short and shocked, then more, urgent. He was working. He wasn't panicked, but he was telling me with every note that something was wrong. I told him to heel. He did not move. Training is good at moments like that. You default to actions. I radios holding here and told dispatch what I had. My voice stayed even. You get to be calm because the sound of your voice has to be usable in the report later. I edged forward, hand on my holster, other hand on the flashlight. The figure made no sound. When I got 10 feet away, I could see more. The shoulders slightly hunched, the outline of a head. I shouted, "Police, show me your hands!" The response was a slow step out of the room. The thing stepped into the doorway, and whatever relief I expected evaporated. It was a person-shaped shadow. There's no other way to say it. But when the light hit the face, I realized there was nothing there I could read. The expression, if you could call it that, didn't change when the light moved. No blinking, no neck muscle, no breath fog in the beam. Rex refused to go any further. He put his body between me and the figure and bristled like a fence. I told him to engage. He would not 1 foot. The line on his collar hummed with tension. We cleared the room as a team. I backed up, got support on the radio, and then we went in with 2 officers. Clear, check left, check right, faces turned to possible hiding places. The bed, under the bed, the closet, the bathroom, nothing, not a single person. A quiet house with no sign someone had been there recently. The window latched from the inside. The sheets smelled like everyone's sheets after a week. Nothing pungent, no fresh footprints on the wooden floor. We searched every nook, every crawl space in that room. I remember sliding the mattress aside and feeling stupid for doing it. I remember thinking I was so sure I'd missed something that I wanted there to be a box with clothes in it, a beer can, anything. Rex would not enter the bedroom. He would edge to the threshold, stare, then lie down with his belly tucked in. He looked like a dog that had decided the wrong side of a line was cursed. You start to question your senses. You're an officer. You're supposed to be practical. You're trained to suspect, to explain, to find an answer. But sometimes your partner has another explanation. I tried to coax him in. I had treats. I had command. I had patience. He stayed put. The other officers joked weakly over the radio, trying to diffuse the tension, but their voices sounded far away. The hallway felt like someone had leaned their ear against it and were listening for a heartbeat. We did a full clear of the rest of the house. We combed the crawl space outside, checked the attic, searched the garage, looked along the fence line. We brought a flashlight and a ladder and took down the plywood from a little basement window. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no tracks in the yard. We went back through the house twice, then 3 times. The more we looked, the less sense it made. The figure had been there, and then had not been anywhere the light could reach. We logged it as a suspicious person call, with no suspect located. We filed the report. Back at the cruiser, the adrenaline ebbed, and what was left was a tight, cold feeling in my chest. Rex laid his head on my boot in the squad lot and stayed there for a long time. He wouldn't jump into the cruiser until I opened his door and told him in a soft voice that we were done. He seemed relieved when the city lights rolled by, like he trusted motion more than rooms. The other officers made offhand jokes. Maybe it was a mannequin, maybe old man Jenkins' scarecrow. But the jokes didn't land. Not on me. I knew that dog. When a dog that had been in burning houses refused to go into a bedroom, he wasn't being dramatic. He was being a dog. People who hear this want closure. We wanted closure. We stayed on the case for a week. Extra patrols in the area, knocks on doors, canvassing. Some neighbors said they'd heard creaks at night. Others said they hadn't seen anything unusual. A few old-timers suggested the house had been uninhabited for a while. There was no evidence of a break-in. No fingerprints to pull, no DNA to test. There were no charges. The report sits in a file somewhere in the property crime unit, maybe read once by a detective who made a note and moved on. We didn't even get to a suspect name. That kind of lack of resolution is worse than a bad ending. At least with a bad ending you can put the person away. With an unknown, the only thing that stays with you is the memory. I still dream about the shape at the end of the hall, not in the night terrors kind of way, but in the way that when I walk past a closed door now, my hand will pause on the knob a beat longer. Call it superstition, call it caution. I call it respect for the line Rex drew. I don't have words to explain what stood there that night, neither does anyone else. The dog wouldn't go in, and sometimes that's all the proof you get. If you want more real police stories that won't let you sleep, subscribe. If that unsettled you, wait, because what comes next was worse. I was a rookie the night the call came in that would teach me the difference between hearing a voice and understanding a person. My name doesn't matter on the radio. What matters is that I answered the call, and I still hear that voice in the quiet hours. It was the kind of storm that doesn't so much rain as it presses water out of the sky in sheets. Street lamps blinked out with the wind. The power had gone in chunks across town, and we were riding the blackouts like they were another kind of darkness. Dispatch lit up my cruiser. Possible child voice on a 911 call. Location sent. Claire's voice came over the dispatcher speaker, clear, calm. The way all dispatchers sound, until you realize they are holding everything together and you're the one who will have to act on it. She said she'd patched the call through and that the caller was now quiet. The tone of her voice made the hair on my arms stand up. I knocked out to the address and saw nothing at first. The house sat low, shuttered windows, paint peeling in strips where water had teased it away. The porch light was dead, the gutter banging like a loose jaw in the wind. An abandoned look, except for a car in the drive that hadn't been there in the photos the department had on file. Rain tattooed my jacket, and my boots left small, dark puddles on the stoop. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. From somewhere inside there came a sound that made me freeze. A voice, weak, high, like a child's, but too steady, like someone who had been practicing a sound for a long time. "Hello?" I called into the dark house. The voice answered from somewhere deeper in the rooms. "I'm here." It sounded small, it sounded practiced. I remember the rookie part of me that felt that the call could be a prank, someone messing with us, a trick to get attention. I told myself that aloud could be a crank call, because saying it makes your voice sound like someone who is in control. Claire ran my license plate on the radio and told me backup was en route. Chris, the officer who had become my anchor during the first months on nights, called over the scanner that he was going to come around the side. He'd been in the business a little longer, and had the kind of calm that comes from seeing 1,000 things go wrong and knowing most could be fixed. When the homeowner answered the door, he looked like someone who was surprised to be remembered. He was middle-aged, cheeks a little red from the cold, a cigarette halfway smoked in a trembling hand. His eyes slid off me when I asked if there were children inside, like a man who'd been asked a question he didn't want to answer. "No," he said, "no kids here. There's just me." The way he hurried the words made them ring false in my ears. The house smelled of stale smoke and something else I couldn't place at the time, like fabric left wet and folded in a dark closet. We asked and knocked some more. The living room was a chaos of piles, clothes, boxes, things that might once have been furniture. Dolls sat on a shelf, some of them turned so you couldn't see their faces. A couple of diapers lay like paper afterthoughts beside a threadbare armchair. It wasn't the kind of mess that happens when a young family is overwhelmed. It had an arrangement to it, an intentionality that sat wrong in the space. There were women's clothes in a heap on the floor, arranged almost as if someone had set them aside for later. It put a pressure in my chest I hadn't expected. I told dispatch we needed to get in and clear the basement. Claire's voice came back over the radio. "Copy. Have you got consent?" I remember the pause that felt longer than it should. The homeowner said no, he didn't want us in. He said we couldn't come in without a warrant. His tone was smooth, like a man suddenly playing the role of someone who knew his legal rights. The rain pushed at the edges of the porch. My rookie training said you live and die by the law, and usually we wait to do things the right way, but there are moments that don't have time for a slow roll. We called in for a telephonic warrant. Those nights you learn how fast the phone can move things, even in a storm, the court clerk answered. Dispatch patched the affidavit, and we explained our exigent circumstances. Possible child in danger, uncooperative owner, ongoing 911 call. Claire kept the radio on the air, letting us hear the steady cadence of someone on the other end of a separate script. Chris stood at the front window and watched the house through the downpour, his breath fogging the glass. He kept telling jokes to try to keep the tension from settling into our bones. He failed. There are things you can't joke away. When the telephonic warrant came through, the shift changed. It went from, "let's see what's up," to, We have a legal basis to go in. It gives you a permission of sorts, both to enter and to steal yourself. We made the approach as a team. I had my light, Chris had his, and a third officer covered the back. Claire kept our channel open while backup established a perimeter. I remember the sound of our boots in the hallway, the squish of wet soles, water working its way down my collar. The house swallowed sound. Inside, the living room looked worse in close light, crumbs on the table, a lamp with the shade askew, like someone had thrown their hands in the air and never picked it back up. We headed toward the basement door. It was at the back of the house, disguised almost, painted the same color as the pantry so it didn't draw attention. The handle was sticky with something. The lock gave with a twist and a grunt. The basement smelled older than the rest of the house, cold, damp, a metallic edge to it that made my stomach fold. There were noises down there that weren't just the pipes. Small, irregular noises, like someone shifting weight between different surfaces, like breath moving through cloth. The hairs on my forearms lifted and stayed. We descended carefully. The steps were steep, each one clattering like a drum. My light beam cut through dust motes that looked like floating ash. Chris had his hand near his weapon, but not on it. Protocol says you give the occupant a chance to come out on their own. But we hadn't heard footsteps moving up. Instead, we heard a faint voice from deeper in the basement, a voice that sounded like a child humming a tune wrong. We reached a passage, and the door there was bolted. The bolts were old and rusted, and had seen better weather. Someone had used a wrench to get a good grip. There were stains on the floor around the threshold. Too old to tell what exactly, but sharp enough to make you look away. We paused outside the door, the three of us shoulder to shoulder in the gloom. I remember the sweat at my temple even though the house was cold. My radio buzzed, Claire checking on us, saying the telephonic warrant was confirmed and that backup was 10 minutes out. I think it was Chris who muttered, "You ready?" He was trying to keep his voice level, the way men do when they want to reassure, but are themselves ragged with fear. I put my shoulder to the door and pushed. The bolt groaned, and the hinges shrieked. That sound is something your brain files away. It's the sound of a threshold being crossed, not just by you, but by whatever is on the other side. The room opened into a low, concrete space, lit by a single bare bulb, swinging with an uneven rhythm. In the light, the room looked like a set that had been abandoned mid-scene, except it was real, and the air hit me like something that had been sitting too long in a closed place. There were objects in there that made my stomach drop. An old stained chair sat in the center of the room, the kind that has the springs starting to show through. Straps, several of them, lay coiled on the floor nearby. The smell in the room was sharp now, a coppery tang that made my throat go dry. Someone was there, that much I knew. I remember thinking, with the innocence of a rookie, that I'd walked into a room where a person might be asleep, and that this would end with a hand squeezing ours and relief. I stepped toward the chair. Then the voice came, soft, not quite a word, more like a practiced utterance designed to sound like a child, but missing the lilt and innocence, and replaced with something that felt almost hollow. "Play," it said, in that sing-song cadence. It wasn't a child's voice. It was stitched from a child's sounds, worn thin by whatever had made it so. My hand found the handle of the cell phone in my pocket. I radioed over my shoulder to Claire that we were inside and that we needed ambulance and additional units. The radio crackled in answer, automatic and calm. Chris kept sweeping the beam across the room, and the light landed on the chair and then slid to a corner. At first I thought the corner held boxes. Then I realized there was a shadow where a person should have been. "On your left," Chris said quietly. I stepped forward and reached for the chair, the way you might reach for a hand in the dark to pull someone up. My fingers brushed fabric. The chair moved, and the sound was not the creak of an empty cushion, but the rustle of something under clothing. I remember the awful, stupid hope that she would look up and be a child and tell us the terrible story, and that we would be the ones to fix it. The beam caught motion in the corner, and then, before anything could be fully understood, there was a scuffle. A noise like fabric being torn, footsteps slamming into the concrete, and then an animal sound that wasn't quite a yell and not quite a voice. I called out, "Police! Stay still!" The words were automatic, drilled into every new officer. The sound from the corner answered like something pushing against a door. There was a thud, and then a dragging sound. Chris moved fast, faster than I expected, across the room. I remember his hand coming down on a shoulder, the brush of cloth under his palm, the unexpected weight of an adult. The shape collapsed into itself as if someone had let out a breath that had been held for years. And then everything changed. The part of me that had been braced for a child's whimper was hit with a different sound altogether. Full, adult, hoarse. It came out broken, alternating with a high, childlike phrasing. The person, alive, conscious but not free, kept saying the same phrase like a broken record. The voice didn't match the body. It spoke in two registers at once, the rasp of someone who hadn't spoken properly in a long time, and the high pitch of someone forced to mimic a child. It said, "Find me," then laughed in a way that wasn't a laugh. We moved. We cut the bindings on the person's wrists and untied what we could see. My hands shook the way your hands do when you're holding the thing that proves a nightmare was real. Claire was on the radio calling for EMS dispatch, reading our location, getting us the unit numbers we needed. Chris checked for immediate trauma. He called out that the victim was conscious and breathing but cold, and then he started the vital checks that you do just to keep the procedures going. The person we freed was an adult, male, I think, but the voice was stuck. A child's cadence bleeding through like a transmission with static. We had a suspect, rough, unshaved, slow to answer when we asked questions. He squinted at us with the flicker of anger that comes when someone is finally asked to explain themselves and has nothing to say. The homeowner was in handcuffs. His eyes were wet with something not quite shame, not quite calculation. We put the man in the back of the cruiser and covered the victim with a blanket. Chris held a jacket for the survivor and murmured soft, grounding phrases, simple, human things that might untangle a person from experience. Still, even amid that relief, the room had a gravity that didn't lift. There were toys on the floor that had no business in a basement like that. A small rubber duck lay face down near the chair, water dried around it in rings. There were photos taped to the concrete wall at eye level, faces that had been lined up, almost like a family wall that had been repurposed into something else. The victim kept flinching at the flash of our lights, as if any illumination had the potential to become pain. He wouldn't give us a full narrative, the words were scrambled, and sometimes when he tried to answer, he would break into that childlike cadence again, reciting nursery rhymes that sent a chill down my spine. We got an ambulance on scene. EMS took the survivor and began the process of warming him, checking for long-term signs of abuse and malnutrition. We read the homeowner his rights. We started the report that would stretch into hours of interviews and evidence collection. Claire stayed on the line the whole time, rerouting calls, taking notes, making sure every box was checked. Chris and I stood in the doorway and watched the rain slice across the house in sheets, and for the first time that night I realized how much of our job is about being a small, awkward bridge between darkness and help. Even with the rescue and the arrest, the feeling didn't leave me. It sat in my chest like a pebble. The survivor's words kept returning in fragments, a name that might have been a plea. The smell of something burned and then hidden, the way the voice would flicker between ages. People called it a horrific case, and it was. But the worst part wasn't just what we took out of that basement. It was the way the victim had been taught to sound like a child, to behave like one in voice and rhythm. The training of the human being into imitation felt like a cruelty the mind can't fully hold. We handed the case to detectives who did the long work, warrants, interviews, forensic tests. The homeowner was charged with abduction and unlawful restraint, among other things. The survivor spent weeks in the hospital and months after that in therapy to untangle his own voice from what had been forced upon him. I checked in now and then, the way you do when you feel like a bystander who at least had hands on the rescue. The thing that stayed with me was not only the sight of the straps and the chair, but the rehearsal of a child's voice, practiced and used like a tool for control. There are details I still can't shake. The dolls with their faces turned away, the diapers out of place, the way the homeowner answered the door like a man who had rehearsed his denials. People asked whether we made the right call to get a telephonic warrant, whether we should have gone in sooner, whether any of it could have been avoided. The truth sits in the grey spaces. We followed procedure. We saved a man. We arrested someone. Those are facts. The other things, the why, the extent, those are questions detectives keep asking. We drove back through rain that had lightened to a mist. Chris tried to break the heavy silence with a joke about coffee, which landed like a pebble in a well. Claire logged the incident and told us the paperwork would be long. I sat in the cruiser thinking about the sound of that voice. It wasn't a child, and it wasn't just an adult. It was both in a way that suggested someone had spent a long time teaching another human to be small. The image of that chair sat in my head. The room kept replaying like a looping clip. Before I could make sense of any of it, another call came across the scanner. It was the kind of call that makes your hands go cold again, the one that suggests a simplicity you know won't be simple. The channel filled with static, then a voice. 911 hang-up. Possible male screaming. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. The radio buzzed. We had learned in the hours of that night that the ordinary world is full of doors you are not ready to open, and that sometimes, for all the boxes you check and all the warrants you obtain, there are things you can't explain with evidence alone. I pulled away from the curb, the cruiser hydroplaning slightly as the rain slicked the road. The streetlights blinked back into life one by one as we drove toward the next call. There was a different kind of weight now, one that said, we know how bad one house can be. We also know how many houses are out there, how many doors stay closed, and how many voices on the other end of a line are not what they sound like. We did not yet realize that the next night call would be the kind that burrows under your skin and refuses to leave. The next call would lead us to an unlit house, a bathroom with streaks that suggested something violent had happened, and a basement door disguised as a pantry. That is where the missing man case would begin, and where the pieces would not line up the way they were supposed to. The K9's refusal and the childlike voice were not isolated oddities. They were small threads in a larger fabric, a pattern of ordinary facades holding monstrous things. We turned into the next block and slowed. The lights of the cruiser cut through the mist with an unsteady beam. Ahead, between two rows of hedges, a house sat in a pool of darkness, its door ajar. The wet pavement reflected the cruiser lights in a way that made every puddle look like a mirror holding a secret. My stomach tightened again. We had learned that night that normal streets and normal houses could hide what no one should have to know. We hadn't yet learned how thin the line was between being the ones who knock and the ones who have to live with what they find. The open door swallowed the cruiser's beam and gave up a draft that smelled faintly of bleach and something older. Metal, the kind of scent that makes your mouth go dry. We split up instinctively, two officers moving left and right, one taking the stairs. The house didn't look lived in, but it had layers of domestic life all over it. A pair of slippers by the entry, a coffee ring on the console table, a calendar with last month still crossed out. Small things that argued against total abandonment. My light caught a smudge on the hallway wall, a streak that darkened as it traced upward, and for a second I thought it was shadow. Then I saw the pattern, a smear that had been dragged, or something that had wiped against the paint and left a path. Upstairs, the bathroom door was open a hair. The bulb inside flickered on when my light hit the mirror, and the reflection showed the tub, partly full, the water teetering in the porcelain as if someone had just stepped out. There were little ripples across the surface. On the lip of the tub, the towel was folded, but the towel wasn't neat. The tub had a trail on the tiles leading toward it, a darker arc that tapered like someone had left a hand on the wall and slid down. There was an odor in the room that made my stomach constrict. Iron, the old warning smell that people call blood, but that I learned to think of clinically. It wasn't a scream of violence, but it was a language of damage, and it translates fast. I called it out to dispatch, keeping the radio clipped to my vest where the channel would carry my words. Upstairs bathroom, possible blood transfer. Need forensics, perimeter. Claire answered steady, as she always did. Her voice in my ear was the only familiar thing that night that felt anchored. Copy, units inbound. Advise, keep scene preserved if possible. She said the words like a script and like a prayer. We moved through the rest of the house quickly, hands on walls, lights cutting cones across rugs and furniture legs. Nothing in the living room, no overturned chairs, no signs of a struggle there. But the house had a hush to it that sounded wrong, like a theatre between acts. In the kitchen, a glass sat at the edge of the counter with dried rings around it. A microwave hummed when we bumped the switch, emptiness making noise. It was the downstairs door that got us, the one that looked like a pantry, narrow, the same paint as the cabinets, the round knob dulled by grease. Someone had built it to blend in, to make a vertical seam look like a natural place for a broom. I didn't register that until Chris thumped the knob and said, "This don't look right." The knob gave with a soft click that didn't fit the rest of the house. When you see a disguised door, you feel it physically, like someone pulled the fabric back on a stage. The line of logic in my head did the same thing that dogs do, snap to sound source and possible occupant. We opened it. Behind the shelves was a set of steps down into concrete and shadow. The air that hit us was cold and smelled of old pipes and something metallic. There was a single light bulb dangling in the center of the basement, like a sun that didn't want to be noticed. In its wash, the room looked utilitarian, workbench, toolboxes, but then the light passed across a cluster of items that shifted the mood. A cheap folding chair in the center of the floor, zip ties looped through each other on the bench, a length of duct tape coiled like rope, a blanket folded oddly on another chair. There was a smear on the floor that became a pool when the light angled over it. Forensics later would tell us whether it was old or fresh. At the time, my gut told me it hadn't been there for long. The way the towels in the upstairs bathroom had been disturbed, and then the trail that led to the basement made it feel like someone had been moved, like the last few minutes of a person's life, or the last few minutes before a person went missing, had been recorded in dirt and fabric. We moved fast. The radio was busy with the usual protocol: hold position, cover point, advise entry. Chris covered the doorway while I set my boot on the lowest step and stared into the cone of light. The house had a way of crunching sound that night, every footstep loud in the low room. We checked corners and under benches. The chair that had stood in the center had fresh impressions on the cushion, as if someone had been sitting there not long ago. On the floor nearby lay a length of cut zip ties, frayed at the ends. I remember kneeling down to look closer, the rubber smell of cheap plastic in my nostrils. Then something moved. It wasn't a person leaping up. It was a direction, a rush at the back of the room like wind across your cheek. A body bolted from a small dark opening near the far wall, smashed through a flimsy basement window, and vanished into the night in a scatter of glass and leaves. The sound of breaking glass made every plan you have evaporate into instinct. For a second, all of my training had to be decided at once. Pursue, hold, call K9, get perimeter, secure evidence. I barked the commands I knew would be heard. Don't go, stop. The figure was gone. The exit was low. Whoever had fled had to climb through. Broken panes littered the backyard like a constellation. I could see the shape moving between hedgerows, a dark slip across neighboring lawns. Chris was already at the back door. We chased, boots heavy with wet grass. We shouted, tried to get a description. Shadow, hoodie, no face in the rain. The house around us stayed silent, as if it had swallowed the noise on purpose. Claire in dispatch asked if we wanted K9. I didn't even have to think. Affirmative, requesting K9 for track. Last seen heading east between houses. Copy? She acknowledged and patched the call through. Minutes later, headlights cut across the wet pavement and a squad pulled up with a handler at the wheel. Rex. I felt a cold flip in my stomach when I saw him. I remembered the hallway, the way that dog had refused to cross a threshold. We needed what only a dog could give us. A scent trail, the ability to follow in ways we couldn't. The handler clipped the long line to Rex's harness and gave a quick briefing. "Scent pick here," I said, sweeping my flashlight over the splintered window where the suspect had escaped. The handler exhaled, and then he set Rex down. The dog lowered his head and drank the air like an old man drinks whiskey, slow and tasting. His paws moved in a way that looked like he was reading Braille on the ground. He threaded between puddles and shards with a care my feet didn't have. For the first few steps, Rex moved like rocket light, nose to pavement, then lift, then dart. Then he hesitated. His tail went stiff. He wailed a note that meant interest, but not panic. He picked up the scent and took off in a line that cut across yards. We jogged after, keeping radios tight. For a moment I allowed myself the hope that we'd collar someone before they made the next street lamp. That hope is dangerous to hold because it turns into guilt if it fails. Rex's track went steady for a while, and then it ended. Not the usual fade you get where a scent trail loses itself in running water or traffic. It stopped as if struck against a wall. We got to a fence where the grass had been flattened recently, a place where a person could have slid under, but the scent ended in the disturbed soil. We circled, called out, listened. Nothing. No shout, no rustle. The neighborhood was intact again, as if we had been the ones who raised a fuss and the world had righted itself the second we left. We pulled the perimeter tighter and started door knocks, flashlights into hedges, calls into yards. Forensics arrived and began work on the broken window and the evidence left in the house. Detectives combed for anything that tied the scene to a person. In the basement, they found items that made the hair on the back of your neck stand, a cheap wristwatch that matched the homeowner's description from the property file, a small card with a name on it, a wallet with identification that had been left on a table. The homeowner's coat was draped over a chair in the living room. There were prints on the workbench that matched a set later compared in the lab. The evidence pointed to someone who lived there, someone who had reason to be in that basement, but the homeowner was not in the house. There were no signs of him in the backyard after the suspect left. No fresh footprints leading away with clear direction. We had a scatter of clues that suggested he had been present and then not. The pattern of those clues hinted at two possibilities. Someone had staged their own disappearance, or someone had fled and taken them. Neither explanation fits comfortably. Detectives prefer neat narratives. The night prefers loose ends. We filed an APB with the description culled from what little we had. Items, clothing, vague height, and forwarded everything to the Detective Bureau. The image of that abandoned chair and the looped zip ties sat in my head like a repeating frame. Weeks later, the auto records flagged the homeowner's plate at a rest stop miles away. An unverified tip said someone had been seen with a bandaged hand on a bus. Pieces came in alone, not fitting into a coherent whole. Forensics would state whether the blood was the missing man's. It matched a profile that tied to human presence. But human presence doesn't explain movement after the collapse of the scene. A body raced through a window and then vanished. The case file grew thick with statements and thin on closure. We had photos of a chair, a blood trail, the broken window, hair found on a jagged shard of glass. We had a scent, then a blank. We had an address where someone should have been and wasn't. We had neighbors who said they heard nothing, and we had officers who left that scene with a particular heaviness that didn't match the paperwork. We ran checks on the homeowner. There were no prior felonies, no open warrants that explained a disappearance. Friends described him as reclusive. He'd been seen in grocery aisles, in the hardware store, a man you could pass in a parking lot and not notice until you learned his face had a story. Detectives dug into his phone records and finances and found anomalies, charges at odd hours, purchases of tape, and restraints traced to a pack that matched the materials found. But no confession, no trace indicating where a person might have gone after fleeing the shattered window. The months that followed turned into the kind of slow haunt that eats at you differently every day. We ran leads that petered out. We called every shelter within range, every hospital. Sometimes a name would surface in an interview as someone who knew too little. The missing man's case became another open file, a folder on someone's desk that would be revisited when a cold tip came in. It floated in the system like debris. But for us, for the first responders and the detectives who stood in that basement and counted the zip ties one more time, it was a memory with edges. K9 units ran the area for days. Rex was put on the case again because handlers believe their dogs pick up what people miss. That night, and in the days after, Rex tracked a scent to the broken window and then dropped it. He nosed at the threshold and sat, head tilted. I remember his eyes like two dark coins reflecting light, the same way they'd stared at the bedroom doorway weeks before and refused to cross. There is an animal logic that we don't have access to, a sixth sense sort of thing people talk about in hushed tones. You either believe the reading of the dog, or you don't. For me, seeing Rex sit by a broken window and refuse to follow a trail he had just been on felt like seeing a man who knows he'd been lied to by his own shadow. There are a lot of ways cases like this end. Arrest, confession, cold closure. This one ended, so far, with questions. Evidence tied back to the house. The homeowner's property was found in the house. Items linked. DNA matched in ways forensics found significant. But the homeowner was not taken into custody because at the moment of the window crash, someone else had already run into the night. Whether it was an accomplice, a separate criminal, or the homeowner himself moving wildly between stories, we never fully proved. Charges were prepared against persons of interest, then shelved or amended as new information arrived. The criminal justice machine moved like a machine does, slowly, with parts that get stuck. What followed for those of us who were there was not a neat ending, it was a residue. You go home, and the normal things, family, supper, the late-night TV noise, feel tinny. You replay decisions in fractions. Should we have held back? Should we have called more units? Did we spook someone into running? You run through alternatives because alternatives are a consolation you can work through. Guilt laces the memory amber. We had gotten into a house, and we had seen evidence of harm. We had blood and zip ties and a broken pane. We had let someone get away, and that allowed the mind to visit all the versions of what if. Months rolled into a year, and the missing man case stayed in the back of investigators' minds. Detectives followed things up intermittently, phone pings, anonymous tips, sightings that rarely panned out. Once, a caller said they'd seen a man matching the homeowner's description in a town 2 counties over, washing windows at a gas station. We sent a unit, checked, and found only a janitor who thought the officers were wasting his time. Some tips are grief dressed as hope. They temporarily lift an officer's chest, then leave it aching. For me, the worst part was how the images slid into ordinary life. I would be at a grocery store, and an aisle would look like a hallway. Someone with a hood would make my pulse skip the way the shape at the end of Rex's hall did. I would wake, and the house would feel like a map of thresholds, lights off, doors closed, each one a question. Days later, a friend on the force who'd been at the basement said, "You get used to seeing bad things, but you never get used to how they live inside a normal room." That line stuck with me. It is the not knowing that cracks you. Those three calls, Rex's refusal, the voice that wasn't a child, and the basement with its chair and zip ties, share a trait. They took the ordinary and bent it. A bedroom that should have been empty wasn't. A voice on a 911 line that sounded small was the sign of something far more complicated, and a standard pantry door opened onto a scene that meant someone had been hurt. The neighborhood sidewalks and neat hedges hid all of it. Our work happens under lights that dim, in places people assume are safe, and sometimes safety is a fiction that peels away when a radio call interrupts dinner. There are nights I keep replaying the detail that felt least explainable in each story. Rex, laying down at the threshold of a bedroom and looking like he'd felt an electric current across his pores. The survivor in the basement singing a nursery rhyme in pieces and then answering us in a voice that didn't belong to his body. The suspect vanishing through a window and the trail ending like someone had erased the line with a rag. Each image is its own itch. Each makes me check the locks twice. We are trained to find patterns, to close loops, but the world doesn't always cooperate. The result is a roster of open files and a tighter roster of people who carry the memory. For some of us, it's more than memory. It's a shift in posture. You watch the dark a bit differently. You hesitate in front of doors. You trust the things you can see less and the instincts you can't measure more. I found myself paying more attention to Rex's handler when he explained why he believed the dog had refused the room. Not superstition, he said, but a catalogue of micro-reactions animals have that humans are terrible at naming. I remembered the rookie who learned how fast procedure can save a life and how long the aftermath can last. I remembered Chris, who tried to joke to lighten the weight and couldn't. I remembered Claire, keeping the calm voice that let the rest of us do our jobs. We never claimed miracles or ghosts to explain any of it. We logged behaviors, smell, motion, and forensics. We wrote reports. We told prosecutors what we had. We did the work you do when things are complicated. But the police work doesn't cancel out the haunt. It coexists with it. The file folder will be kept, the evidence put through machines, DNA compared, prints checked, phone records parsed. Somewhere along the way there may be an answer, an arrest, a confession, or the case may remain a question mark in a stack of other questions. Sometimes people ask if these calls change you. I don't have a neat answer. They alter the landscape of what you expect. They change which noises get your attention. When I leave a house now, when I walk past a bedroom door, my hand lingers at the knob because of one dog and a shape at the end of a hall. When someone calls 911 and the voice on the line trembles, I listen differently because of the man who sounded like a child. When I see a pantry door, a small part of my mind looks for hinges at strange angles, because a basement once hid the things people don't want to show. These are small shifts, practical and stubborn. The title says, "These are stories that will haunt you," and that's no empty marketing line. It's honest. For those of us who live the work, the haunting isn't theatrical. It's a quiet, persistent reshaping of how you move through the world. People outside the job sometimes think the worst part is the violence. Maybe. For some of us, the worst part is the not knowing, the vision of ordinary rooms holding secrets, and the thought that we were there with our hands on the threshold and couldn't close the loop. There are nights I walk my neighborhood and think about the men and women behind those 3 calls. A dog insisting on a line he won't cross. A voice that taught a person to sound small to control them. A man who disappeared through a window and left too many questions. We did what we could. We followed procedure. We rescued where we could. We sought evidence where evidence existed. We also left things behind. Unanswered questions, a stairwell smell, the crease in a blanket. If this haunted you, share it with someone who understands that what looks ordinary sometimes hides a story that can't be told in daylight. If you want to hear more real police stories like these, stories that don't dress up the truth and won't let you sleep, Like and share this video and check the playlist for other accounts from the night shift. And if you live near a neighbor whose door is always closed, knock once in the daylight. Sometimes the smallest gestures keep the dark from becoming permanent.